The box arrived on a Thursday morning, unannounced, its cardboard edges softened by decades of attic heat and coastal fog. Archivist Emily Carter signed for it with the absent-minded flourish of a woman accustomed to unsolicited donations, forgotten scrapbooks, broken stereographs, mislabeled tintypes. Most led nowhere. Most held nothing but the quiet sediment of ordinary lives. This one felt different the moment she lifted it. Its weight was wrong, not heavy, but dense, as if whatever lay inside carried a gravity out of proportion to cardboard and paper. The return address was from a private residence in Pacifica. No donor name. No explanatory letter. Emily carried the box to her desk in the San Francisco Museum's Special Collections Room. The overhead lights hummed faintly, and the large dehumidifier at the back wall exhaled a constant, low breath that made every quiet moment feel inhabited. Inside the box lay a series of envelopes, each labeled only with a year. 1898, 1901. 1904, 1910. Someone had tried to impose a timeline on the past before giving up halfway. The later envelopes were unmarked. She opened the one labeled 1904. The photograph she slid out was a gelatin silver print, faded, foxed around the edges, but intact. It showed a stretch of Golden Gate Park in early summer, a shallow creek reflecting the pale sky, gum trees casting long shadows, 3 children playing near the water's edge. Their clothes were neat but worn, likely from one of the neighborhoods south of Market Street, where factory whistles regulated childhood as much as school bells. Nothing unusual. Nothing overtly historic. Emily almost set it aside until a glint in the lower left corner drew her eye. One of the boys, thin, barefoot, about 10, held something in his right hand. His fingers curled tightly around it, knuckles sharp against skin. A small metal object, oddly weighty in the way its shadow fell. Emily leaned closer. Then closer still. It wasn't a toy. In the grain of the digitization scanner, she saw that the object was a badge, shield-shaped, slightly dented, the metal darkened irregularly. At the center, though blurred by age, she could just make out letters arcing across the top: Park Patrol, San Francisco, and near the bottom edge, a cluster of dark flecks. Not rust. Not soil. Something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Emily requested a microscopic scan, hands steady only because she had trained them to be. 2 hours later, an expert from the museum's conservation lab confirmed what she already suspected. "It's real," he said, exhaling quietly. "Early issue Park Patrol badge. And the staining, that's not corrosion. Whatever happened to that badge, it wasn't an accident." Emily turned back toward the photograph on her monitor, the image enlarged until individual grains of emulsion formed a soft field of gray. The children were still there by the creek, frozen in the innocence of someone else's ordinary day. But now the scene felt wrong, too quiet, too undisturbed. As if something terrible had just happened nearby. As if the boy's small hand was the only surviving witness. She zoomed out, letting the landscape fill the screen. Golden Gate Park, 1904. Early summer. Mid-morning light. A date surfaced in her memory, a half-remembered footnote from a previous exhibit involving early park infrastructure. June 1904. A ranger found dead near Strawberry Hill. Badge missing. Case unresolved. Emily felt a slow tightening inside her chest. She reached for the nearest database terminal. Whatever lay hidden in that photograph had been waiting more than a century to be seen. Emily began with the newspapers. Always the newspapers. In the cool quiet of the archives, she pulled up the San Francisco Call, June 1904, then the Chronicle, then the short-lived Daily Report. Her search was methodical, practiced, the way one might sift silt for gold, slow at first, then suddenly with purpose when the right glint appeared. She found it in the Call, page 3, a short 2-paragraph column under the heading, "Park Ranger Found Dead." The report was clinical, devoid of sentiment. Ranger Thomas Hale, age 41, was discovered near the base of the Strawberry Hill waterfall shortly after noon on June 17. Initial examination suggests accidental fall. Badge missing from uniform. Investigation ongoing. Emily read it twice, tracing each sentence. A missing badge in 1904, a detail mentioned almost as an afterthought. At the time, the city had been expanding fast, the park still young and unruly around the edges. Mishaps were common. A ranger found dead near rocks and water would scarcely raise alarm. But the badge, that small, stubborn detail, would not leave her. She searched further. An evening edition published a brief update. Authorities have recovered no personal effects other than Hale's satchel, found some yards from the body. Contents include notes regarding patrol routes and park maintenance. No sign of struggle observed. No sign of struggle. A phrase that often meant investigators had not looked closely enough. Emily opened the photograph again. The children by the creek. The boy gripping the metal badge. And behind them, trees, low brush, a sloping path that could easily lead toward Strawberry Hill. The timestamp on the donation envelope matched the newspaper date almost exactly. The photograph had been taken the same day Hale died. And likely the same morning. She zoomed in on the children's faces. Their expressions were ambiguous, caught somewhere between curiosity and unease, as if aware of something off-frame that the camera had not captured. The creek behind them fed into a narrow channel that ultimately curved toward the western base of the hill. If the body had been found around midday, and these children were already exploring near that location earlier, then they had been close. Too close. Emily consulted the museum's map collections, tracing the 1904 park layout. The photograph's vantage point matched an area just southwest of Strawberry Hill, an underdeveloped clearing later landscaped over. In 1904, it had been secluded, rarely patrolled. A place where a man could be led without notice. She returned to the newspaper. Another small detail emerged. Hale had been seen alive around 9 o'clock a.m. by a gardener pulling invasive acacia shoots. The gardener remembered Hale. Heading west, toward the waterfall, carrying a satchel. As though in hurry. If the photograph was taken around mid-morning, as the angle of light suggested, then it captured the window between Hale's last confirmed sighting and the grim discovery of his body. Emily leaned back in her chair, pulse quickening. The boy in the photograph was not simply holding the missing badge. He was holding evidence from the crime scene minutes after the murder. She needed more than newspapers. Emily requested the city's 1904 coroner's ledger, stored on microfilm. The record, faint but legible, stated, "Cause of death, cranial. Trauma consistent with fall. Body exhibited contusions along left shoulder and forearm. Time of death estimated between 10 o'clock and 11 a.m. Inconsistent with the official narrative. A fall could cause cranial trauma, yes, but bruises along the arm suggested restraint or struggle. And the note about Hale's satchel being found, some yards from the body, seemed deliberate. As if taken, examined, then discarded. Emily exhaled slowly. No one had wanted to consider foul play. The badge, missing at the scene. The photograph, showing it in the hand of a child. The body, found later in an area adults rarely visited that early. She pulled up all correspondence from the Park Commission from that month. One brief memo stood out. A complaint filed by Hale himself only 2 weeks before his death, noting persistent irregularities among patrol officers and unauthorized activity near maintenance stores. A flare of unease lit her gut. Ranger Thomas Hale had been investigating something. And whatever he had discovered, someone had wanted silenced. Emily looked again at the photograph. The faint shadow on the creek's edge, the way the children stood not in play but frozen soon after encountering something alarming. The boy's face hinted at a fear he did not understand. The police report had accepted the accidental fall without question. The city had moved on. But the camera had not. The photograph had waited 120 years for someone to look closely. Emily now had her first connection, a ranger dead under suspicious circumstances. A badge taken. Children unknowingly holding the missing evidence. She reached for the next envelope, labeled 1904 to 1906, its flaps sealed with brittle glue. The glue cracked softly under her fingers. Whatever was inside would take her deeper. And she already suspected the truth: this was no accident. The archive had just whispered the first confirmation of a murder long buried beneath the city's growing bones. Emily cleared a space on her desk and arranged the documents she had pulled from the municipal archives. The next step was simple in theory: identify the children. In practice, the task required patience, cross-referencing, and a willingness to stare at grainy faces until they began to feel almost alive again. The 1904 school census for the southern districts of San Francisco listed every pupil enrolled that year. Emily flipped through pages of careful handwriting until she reached the neighborhood south of Market Street, where houses clustered tightly and families moved often, pulled by unstable wages and shifting chance. She compared the photograph with the census entries, searching for siblings close in age, one around 12, the other roughly 10. After 2 hours, she found them: Lizzie Boyd, age 12, and Samuel Boyd, age 10. The record noted their residence on Langton Street, an area of narrow alleys and crowded wooden buildings. Their father worked irregular jobs at the docks. Their mother took laundry from nearby boarding houses. Emily retrieved the city directory for 1904 and found the Boyd family listed at the same address. Nothing unusual, just another working-class household trying to survive the rising cost of a growing city. But the existence of the siblings in the photograph confirmed that the boy holding the tarnished badge was Sammy Boyd, the girl beside him Lizzie. She studied their faces again. Lizzie stood slightly behind her brother, one hand at his shoulder, her expression composed but watchful. Sammy's gaze was fixed not on the photographer but towards something outside the frame, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. The badge in his grip gleamed faintly. Emily moved next to neighborhood maps from 1904 to determine how far the Boyd home lay from Golden Gate Park. The distance was considerable, too far for children to wander alone without purpose. And yet the newspaper had reported unusually warm weather that week, enough to draw families across the city into the park. Perhaps the Boyds had ventured there for a rare day of leisure. Still, something about the children's posture suggested otherwise. They were not playing. Their feet were planted firmly, bodies tense, as though they had stumbled into something they did not yet understand. Emily opened another folder: City Relocation Records from 1906, compiled after the earthquake and fires. She searched automatically for the Boyd name, expecting the usual notations of displacement or temporary lodging. What she found instead made her pause. The Boyd family had not remained in the city after the disaster. They had left abruptly, relocated to rural Nevada in May 1906, barely a month after the earthquake. The relocation was listed without explanation. Most families who fled the ruins gravitated toward nearby towns or temporary camps, not distant states. Such a sudden departure suggested urgency, not mere evacuation. Emily traced the record further. The Boyds had boarded a transport wagon organized by a church relief group. Their final destination was listed only as Mining District, Central Nevada. No exact town. No documented return. A forced relocation? A flight from fear? Perhaps the family had stumbled upon more in the park that morning than a misplaced badge. Emily checked the 1906 refugee registries for additional clues. One entry noted a brief interview with Mrs. Boyd, who mentioned leaving the city due to unsettling events before the disaster. The phrase was vague, almost evasive, but its placement on an official form suggested she had insisted on including it. Emily copied the line, underlined it twice, and returned to the photograph. Lizzie's eyes seemed older than her years, burdened by knowledge she should not have possessed. Sammy's fingers cinched tightly around the metal badge, as if he feared someone might demand it back. Emily considered the possibilities. The children had been in the park that morning, perhaps before Ranger Hale's death had been reported. If they had seen something, an argument, a struggle, a body, they might have carried that secret home. Secrets carried by poor families rarely found safe outlets. Fear could linger like smoke. And in a city where corruption threaded through official ranks, a witness might find danger rather than protection. Emily flipped to the next set of relocation notes. A final remark stood out: the Boyds' departure had been marked. Urgent, family requests immediate transfer. No other family on the page had such a notation. She leaned back, letting the weight of the discovery settle. The children in the photograph were not bystanders. They were bordering the edge of a crime before even understanding what danger meant. And whatever they witnessed had followed their family for 2 years, until catastrophe gave them an excuse to vanish. The photograph had preserved a moment of stillness, but beneath it ran a current of silent dread. A badge in a child's hand. A ranger dead. A family fleeing. Emily closed the file gently. The next step was unavoidable. She needed descendants, someone living who might hold the final key. The archive had big *n to open, and its shadows pointed forward. Emily waited 3 days before reaching out to the Boyd descendants. She wanted the timeline firm, her notes in order, the emotional distance she knew she would lose once living. Voices entered the story. The census trail placed Lizzie's surviving line somewhere in the Central Valley. A few calls, 2 hesitant emails, and at last a quiet response arrived from Margaret Boyd Ellis, Lizzie's granddaughter. Margaret agreed to meet at her home in Modesto. She wrote little, adding only, "I have something that belonged to my grandmother. I'm not sure I want to know what it means." When Emily arrived, Margaret, a woman in her 70s with a careful manner and soft voice, led her to a dining table already set with a small wooden box, the lid trembling slightly under Margaret's hand. "She kept every letter she ever wrote," Margaret said. "Most were ordinary, recipes, church notices, weather complaints. But when she was dying, she asked my mother to hide one. After my mother passed, I found it. I never opened it." Her eyes moved to Emily with a steady, resigned sadness. "But I think you already know why I finally did." She opened the box. Inside lay a thin packet tied with string and a folded sheet of brittle paper addressed simply, "For whoever asks." Margaret untied the string with deliberate care. The letter inside was written in Lizzie's firm, uneven hand, each line pressed deeply, as though she had written with trembling force. The date at the top read 1963, the year she died. Emily read silently while Margaret watched the window, unable to witness the unfolding of a truth that had lived in her family like a bruise. "I was 12 when it happened." The letter began. "Sammy and I went to the park early because the heat was coming. We walked near the creek, following a noise, 2 men shouting. We hid behind the brush. I saw Ranger Hale, the tall one with the leather satchel. And I saw the other man, the one in the dark uniform. He was a park officer, though I did not know his name then." Emily paused, breath tightening. Margaret spoke quietly behind her. "My grandmother said very little about her childhood. But sometimes she would go silent for minutes at a time, as if drifting backward." Emily continued reading. They argued about papers. Hale kept saying, "I won't look away." The other man told him to forget it, that no one will listen to you, not after this. Hale tried to push past him. The officer struck him, once, hard enough that Hale fell. His head hit the rock. He did not move again. Lizzie's next lines bore indentations of her pen digging into the page. The officer took Hale's satchel. He opened it, took some documents. I think he meant to take the badge too, but it must have fallen. Emily imagined the moment, the man walking away calmly, the children stepping into the clearing, Sammy crouching beside the still warm body, lifting the badge because he did not yet understand death or danger. Sammy wanted to tell someone. Lizzie wrote. I told him no. I knew what men like that could do. We were poor. Children like us were not believed. And the officer looked important. Not a man anyone would question. Margaret pressed her hands together, knuckles whitening. The letter continued with staggering simplicity. 2 days later, a man in uniform came to our building. He asked around. Wanted to know if anyone saw anything. I recognized his ring, a gold band with a red stone. The same as the man who led the ranger. He didn't look at us directly. But my mother did. She knew. She packed our things that night. Emily felt the revelation settle like dust after collapse. AK*ler seeking witnesses, a family fleeing both a murder and a murderer protected by power. We left after the great shaking in 1906. Lizzie wrote. People thought we fled the fires, but we fled him. My mother said the earthquake was God giving us a door to run through. The letter ended without flourish. If someone ever comes asking, tell them Hale did not fall. He was pushed. Tell them the man who pushed him became something important afterward. That is the worst part. He was not punished. He was celebrated. Emily folded the letter carefully, as if it were a living thing that might break. Margaret's eyes were wet but steady. I always wondered why they left so suddenly. Margaret whispered. My mother said only that San Francisco was unsafe for truth. The room fell into a respectful quiet. Emily knew now that the photograph was more than a curious artifact. It was the first frame of a crime seen through children's eyes, then carried through generations by silence. And Lizzie, at the end of her life, had tried to pierce that silence the only way she knew, by writing a confession for someone yet unborn to find. Emily closed her notebook. She had the witness statement she never expected, a testimony written across half a century, preserved by a granddaughter who had feared its meaning. The past, buried for so long, was finally shifting. Emily drove back to the museum with Lizzie's confession, echoing in her mind like a voice carried across water, distorted, fading, yet unmistakably real. The name she needed had not been written explicitly, but the identifying detail was enough: a gold ring with a red stone, worn by a man in uniform. A park officer in 1904. She began at the Park Commission rosters, stored in the municipal archives basement level. The room smelled of desiccated paper and dust disturbed too rarely. She combed through staff registers from 1902 to 1906, listing every patrolman and officer who served during those years. 5 names matched the rank described. Only one included a personnel note indicating a disciplinary reprimand in early 1904, William Crow, park security officer, age 32. The reprimand was mild, unauthorized access to maintenance storerooms. But Emily had seen enough archival euphemisms to recognize a smoothed-over offense. What caught her attention more was the small photograph paperclip to his file, a staff portrait. Crow stood stiffly, shoulders squared, cap angled precisely. His expression conveyed certainty, the kind that ignored dissent by refusing to acknowledge it. But it was his left hand resting on the hilt of his nightstick that held Emily's gaze. There it was, a thick gold ring set with a deep red stone. Her breath tightened. She turned the file over, searching for subsequent updates. Instead of punishment or dismissal, the record showed rapid advancement. By 1908, Crow had been promoted to senior officer. By 1911, he supervised patrol operations. And then, a leap that stole Emily's breath, appointed chief of security for the Panama Pacific International Exposition, 1915. The exposition had been a triumph for the city, a rebirth after the earthquake, a symbol of resilience and modernity. The chief of security would have been a public figure responsible for safeguarding an event that drew millions. Emily searched online through digitized collections of photographs from the exposition. It took only moments to find him. There he stood, positioned proudly beside visiting dignitaries, his uniform immaculate. The gold ring was visible even in the distance, glinting under the sun like a small, arrogant star. The caption beneath read, Chief William Crow, lauded for exemplary service. Emily zoomed in. His face remained as rigid and controlled as in the earlier portrait, but now she saw something else, an air of entitlement sharpened by success. A man who had built a career atop a secret he assumed would never surface. Crow's trajectory did not end with the exposition. Newspaper clippings from the 1920s called him a guardian of civic order, a legend of city safety, a man whose vigilance shaped modern policing. He retired celebrated and died in 1948 with an obituary that described him as a towering pillar of integrity in the formative years of San Francisco's growth. Emily sat back, the enormity of the distortion settling heavy in her chest. A murderer had been memorialized as a hero. She reopened Lizzie's letter mentally, hearing again the trembling clarity in the words written near death. He was not punished. He was celebrated. It was not exaggeration. It was fact. Emily traced Crow's life backward again, searching for any sign of inquiry, suspicion, or complaint that might have hinted at violence beneath the polished exterior. She found none. The city had accepted his narrative of order without ever examining the chaos he created. But Lizzie had given Emily the key. The boy's badge held in that photograph, Crow's missing piece, was the first fracture in the facade he built. It placed Crow at the scene. It placed the children as witnesses. And if Hale's satchel contained documents related to corruption, then Crow's motive became unmistakably clear. Emily spread Crow's photographs before her. The ring appeared in every image, always on his left hand. It was not simply jewelry. It was a signature, an identity, a symbol of power he believed unquestionable. She returned to the photograph taken in the park. The children's faces blurred by time, the creek behind them still and deceptive. And Sammy Boyd's hand wrapped tightly around evidence that would one day destroy the myth of an innocent city. Emily closed her eyes briefly. The silence around Crow had lasted too long. She turned to the final missing piece, Ranger Hale's own family. If anyone had preserved doubts, even in private notes or fading grief, their testimony could illuminate the last shadowed corner of the case. Emily reached for her phone. It was time to find the Hales. Finding the Hale family required more work than Emily expected. Ranger Thomas Hale had left behind a wife and 2 children in 1904, but the earthquake and fires of 1906 scattered thousands of families, destroying civic records and forcing survivors into improvised migrations. Emily traced a thin paper trail, fragments of voter registrations, an insurance claim, a church baptism, and eventually found a living descendant, Daniel Hale, great-grandson of the murdered ranger. He agreed to meet her in Sacramento, where he worked as a land surveyor. His reply had been brief. "My family always believed the story was wrong. I'd like to hear what you found." Daniel was in his early 50s, tall, with a posture that suggested years spent reading terrain and translating it into maps. He welcomed Emily into his modest office, its walls lined with topographical charts. When she explained the photograph, the badge, and Lizzie's confession, he listened without interruption. Only the tightening of his jaw betrayed the quiet surge of something long dormant. "My grandmother, Thomas's daughter, spoke about her father sometimes," he said after a long pause. "She said the official story never matched the man she knew. But she didn't have proof. Only suspicions passed down like fading echoes." He opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook bound in cracked leather. The pages were yellow with age, the ink brown and feathered. "These were my great-grandmother's notes," he said. "She kept them after his death. I never showed them to anyone." He laid the notebook open between them. Emily scanned the entries, brief lines written by a grieving widow, but sharp with conviction. "Tom told me last night he intends to confront the officers taking bribes from the hunters. He says some men let poachers into the park for payment. He fears retaliation but thinks speaking out is his duty." One entry, dated 3 days before the murder, made Emily's skin prickle. He mentioned a man named Crow. Said Crow warned him to stop asking questions. "Tom won't be silent." There it was, the missing thread stitched directly into the family's own memory. Emily felt the weight of confirmation settle into her bones. Hale had not died by misstep or accident. He had been silenced while uncovering a corruption network embedded within the very institution meant to protect the city's public spaces. "I can't say I'm surprised," Daniel murmured. "But seeing it written, knowing his fear was real, It's different from hearing stories told in old age. Emily exhaled slowly. There's someone else who should see this. She arranged a meeting between Danielle and Margaret Boyd Ellis, Lizzie's granddaughter. They met at the museum after hours, in the special collections room where the photograph had first revealed its secrets. The lights hummed softly. Outside, fog collected along the windows like ghostly breath. Margaret arrived with the wooden box she had shown Emily earlier. Daniel greeted her with a cautious nod, unsure what bound them besides the long shadow of a single morning in 1904. Emily projected the photograph onto the archival screen. Its grayscale tones filled the room, children beside a creek, Sammy's hand gripping the badge that had vanished from history. Margaret's voice trembled but held steady. My grandmother carried fear her entire life. She never said the man's name, but she described him. And she made sure someone would one day know. Daniel pressed his palm against the edge of the table. Your family saw what mine never could. You gave us back the truth. Margaret opened the wooden box and removed a smaller tin container, dented at one corner. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside lay the object that had haunted the photograph, the Park Patrol badge, its surface darkened, its edges worn but unmistakable. Time had not erased the stains. It had preserved them. My grandmother hid it after the earthquake, Margaret whispered. She said destroying it would be wrong. She said one day someone brave would need it. Emily stared at the badge, almost reverent. After more than a century, the material evidence had returned. Daniel reached out, not touching it yet, only letting his hand hover above it, an acknowledgement of both inheritance and loss. This belonged to my great-grandfather, he said softly. This is the piece they took from him. The three stood in shared silence. For the first time, two families, one burdened by fear, the other by unanswered grief, faced the truth together. Their ancestors, separated by class, race, and circumstance, had been drawn into the same violent moment. And that moment had survived only because children had stood beside a creek and a camera had captured their innocence against the backdrop of injustice. Emily gathered her notes, aware that history itself seemed to be holding its breath. We have everything now, she said. The testimony. The records. The badge. This isn't just a forgotten crime. It's a story the city chose not to see. Daniel looked at Margaret, then at the photograph glowing on the wall. Let's make them see it. The museum released Emily's findings on a fog-heavy Tuesday morning. The press gathered in the small auditorium, unaware that the story they had come to hear would tilt the city's historical narrative on its axis. For more than a century, Ranger Thomas Hale had existed as a minor footnote, a man who slipped on wet stone and died unnamed in the city's memory. Now the truth stood assembled before them, documents, testimonies, a photograph that refused to stay silent. Emily presented each piece with the precision of someone who understood the weight of history. She began with the Snapshot *T, children beside a creek in 1904, the boy holding the missing badge. She moved to Hale's notes, the widow's warnings, the concealed corruption among park officers. Then she revealed the confession Lizzie wrote at the end of her life, a child's witness carried across decades of silence. And finally, she displayed the badge Sammy had lifted from the ground, preserved in a tin box by a woman who refused to let truth die. The journalists shifted, their pens stilling. Silence took the room like a held breath. When Emily spoke Crow's name, the atmosphere changed. William Crow, lauded guardian of the Panama Pacific Exposition, celebrated protector of early San Francisco, unmasked as a murderer who built his life upon a single violent erasure. The revelation cracked through the auditorium, the weight of it undeniable. The city officials responded swiftly, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of recognition that some debts, though ancient, still demanded payment. They convened a review panel. Archives were reopened. Hale's record was amended, his death reclassified from accident to homicide. A public acknowledgement followed, the kind rarely granted to those buried beneath the sediment of time. An injustice was committed. The city recognizes Ranger Thomas Hale as a victim of corruption and honors his service. A week later, under the pale morning sun of Golden Gate Park, a small crowd gathered near Strawberry Hill. A new memorial plaque stood beside the waterfall, its surface dark bronze, its inscription clear and spare, in memory of Ranger Thomas Hale 1873–1904, who died in service to this park and this city. Truth endures. Daniel Hale stood at its center, the badge cupped in his hands. Like a relic. Margaret Boyd Ellis stood beside him, her expression solemn but unburdened, as if her grandmother's voice had at last been heard. When Daniel stepped forward, he spoke quietly, yet his words carried. My family lived with questions for generations. Today those questions rest. My great-grandfather tried to protect this park. He paid for it with his life. And 2 children, too young to understand danger, held the truth when no adult would listen. Margaret approached, the wooden box in her hands. She opened it once more, revealing the badge. Daniel accepted it, his fingers trembling slightly. This belongs to your family, Margaret said. My grandmother kept it safe. Now it can go home. The ceremony ended without spectacle. The crowd dispersed, leaving only the 3 of them standing beneath the filtered light through the trees. The creek flowed nearby, unchanged, indifferent yet eternal. Emily looked toward the water, imagining the children frozen in the photograph, Lizzie with her guarded eyes, Sammy clutching the badge. Ordinary children caught in the orbit of corruption they could not name. Children whose silence had not been cowardice, but survival. The plaque gleamed softly in the morning sun. History had shifted, if only by inches. But sometimes an inch was enough to break open a century.